In 1833, Britain did something the rest of the world celebrated. It abolished slavery across the empire. The history books call it a moral triumph, a nation finding its conscience, the end of one of the cruelest systems ever devised by human beings. But there is a part of that story Britain does not put on its monuments, because when slavery was abolished, the government paid out an enormous sum of money in compensation. £20 million, the equivalent of roughly £17 billion today. And not a single penny of it went to the people who had been enslaved. It went to the people who had owned them. This is the story of the £17 billion Britain paid to slave owners. Part 1. The machine that made the money. To understand how this happened, you have to understand what slavery actually was to the British establishment. It was not a fringe activity. It was not something done by a handful of bad men in distant colonies. It was a central pillar of the national economy. Across the Caribbean, in Jamaica, Barbados, Trinidad, Grenada, and beyond, hundreds of thousands of enslaved people worked on British plantations. They cut sugarcane under a brutal sun. They worked until they died, and when they died, they were replaced. The conditions were so lethal that on many islands the enslaved population could not even sustain its own numbers without constant new arrivals from across the Atlantic. And from that suffering came sugar. From sugar came money. Enormous, world-changing amounts of money. That money did not stay in the Caribbean. It flowed back to Britain. It built banks and insurance houses. It funded grand country estates whose gardens tourists still walk through today. It paid for railways, for harbours, for libraries, for political careers. The wealth of entire cities was tied up in it. So slavery was not a stain on the edge of British prosperity. For a long time it was British prosperity. And the men who controlled it were not powerless outsiders. They sat in Parliament. They dined with ministers. They formed one of the most effective lobbying groups the country had ever seen. That detail matters, because it explains everything that came next. Part 2. The price of freedom. By the early 1800s, the campaign to abolish slavery had grown into a genuine mass movement. Hundreds of thousands of ordinary Britons signed petitions. Enslaved people themselves rose up in revolt, again and again, and those uprisings shook the confidence of the entire system. So abolition came, but it did not come freely. The slave-owning class did not simply accept defeat. They had the power to block the law, and they made one thing absolutely clear. They would agree to abolition only if they were paid for it. Paid for what, exactly? For the loss of their property. Because under British law, enslaved human beings were not people. They were assets. They appeared in account books alongside cattle and furniture and land, listed by name, by age, by monetary value. And when the government moved to take those assets away, the owners demanded to be reimbursed at full market price. Parliament agreed. It was in the end a negotiation. And in that negotiation only one side had a seat at the table. The enslaved were the subject of the bargain. They were never a party to it. Part 3. The biggest payout in British history. The numbers are staggering. The £20 million the government set aside was around 40% of the entire national budget for that year. To raise it, the British state took out one of the largest loans in its history up to that point. Think about what that means. The country went deep into debt. Not to free people, not to compensate the victims, but to pay the men who had profited from their suffering. Roughly 46,000 claims were filed by people seeking their share, and the records still exist. Historians at University College London spent years cataloguing every single payment in a database of British slave ownership. What they found was uncomfortable for a great many people. The recipients were not shadowy figures lost to history. They were bishops and barristers, members of parliament, wealthy widows who owned a handful of people on a distant island they had never once visited, clergymen, some of Britain's grandest families, ancestors of prime ministers, of celebrated authors, of public figures whose names are still recognised today. A single large planter could receive a sum equivalent to millions of pounds in modern money. For human beings he had never treated as human at all, and that money did not sit idle. It built more estates, it launched more businesses, it was reinvested into the very economy we have inherited. You cannot fully separate the wealth of modern Britain from this payout. It is sewn into the foundations. Part 4. The people who got nothing and the enslaved, the men, women and children whose entire lives had been stolen, they received nothing. Worse than nothing, in fact. because abolition did not actually free most of them straight away. Instead, the law created something called apprenticeship. Formerly enslaved people were required to keep working for their former masters, unpaid, for several more years. It was slavery wearing a different word, a system designed to soften the financial blow to the owners and to squeeze a few more years of free labour out of the people they had brutalised. So the people who had suffered the most were forced to keep working, and the people who had inflicted that suffering were handed a fortune. No reparations, no apology, no land, no back pay. Nothing for the generations of stolen labour, for the families torn apart on auction blocks, for the lives ended in the cane fields and in the holds of ships crossing the Atlantic. The arithmetic of it is almost too cruel to believe. Britain decided in writing that the victims of slavery were owed nothing, and that the owners of slavery were owed £17 billion. Part 5. The debt that outlived everyone. But here is the detail that stops people cold. That loan, the money Britain borrowed to pay the slave owners, was so enormous that it was not paid off quickly. It was not paid off in a decade. It was not paid off in a century. The British government finished paying down that debt in 2015. Read that again. 2015. Which means that for nearly 200 years, the cost of compensating slave owners was quietly folded into the national finances. It means that taxpayers across generations, people who never owned anyone, people whose own ancestors may have been enslaved, people who had no idea any of this was happening, were helping to service a debt taken out to reward slaveholders. In 2018, the Treasury itself acknowledged it. In a message it later deleted, it told the public, almost as a cheerful fact, that millions of citizens had helped finish paying off the slavery compensation loan only a few years earlier. The reaction was not the warm, patriotic glow the Treasury seemed to expect. For many people, it was the first time they had ever heard that the debt existed at all. Part 6. The money never left. And this is the part that reaches into the present day. That £17 billion did not vanish. It became inheritance. It became property. It became the head start that one set of families carried into the modern world, while another set carried nothing but the memory of bondage. When you trace where slavery money landed, you find it in famous banks, in insurance firms, in stately homes now run as charming visitor attractions, in fortunes that have been passed down through 5 or 6 generations without interruption. The compensation did not close the book on slavery. It rolled the profits forward into the present. This is why the debate over reparations is so raw. It is not an argument about ancient history. It is an argument about money that can still be traced, paid to people who can still be named, with consequences that can still be measured. This is the part of abolition Britain prefers not to discuss. The clean version of the story ends with Parliament outlawing slavery and the nation patting itself on the back. The full version reveals where the money went and who was made to pay for it, and for how long. £20 million, 17 billion in today's terms. 40% of the national budget. A debt carried for almost 2 centuries, all of it flowing to the people who had bought and sold human beings, and none of it to the human beings themselves. Britain has never repaid the descendants of the enslaved. It has never formally apologised for the trade, but for nearly 200 years it never once missed a payment to the families of those who profited from it. So when a nation tells you it abolished slavery out of conscience, it is worth asking one simple question. Then who exactly got paid?